The timer was bleeding down, but nobody needed to see the digits to feel it. The range took a breath and held it. A young specialist did not touch his trigger. He watched the thin grass just left of the target, where wind tells the truth without trying to impress anyone. Someone near the middle stifled a laugh. Sure, he'd already missed. But even through ear protection, the clearest thing was the wind's uneven hum, like a calm voice speaking to only one person on the line. If stories built on patience and real moments speak to you, hit subscribe and tell us which city and state you're watching from. It helps these quiet stories find their people. Heat pressed off the earth, and a fine curtain of dust hovered in front of the silhouettes. 12 shooters had stepped forward for a standard rifle qualification. On the far end stood Specialist Reed Collins, a quiet transfer from logistics who had spent months relearning field rhythm after years of warehouse rhythm. He carried no dramatic opinions onto the line, only care. Captain Dana Cruz paced the chalk, glanced once at the wind flags and once at the shooter's shoulders, then explained the strings and the safety order in the tone of someone who trusts procedure more than volume. Wait for the call. Respect the boundaries. Safety is not a slogan. It is the frame. A few whispers rose mid-line, the harmless bravado that appears whenever a day looks ordinary. Those whispers didn't change the wind or the paper. When the first string began, the range returned to its usual breathing. Each break of the trigger cut a small scar into the dust, and the sound of metal landing was a steady bass under the muffs. Reed tied his breathing to feel instead of numbers. There was nothing theatrical in his hold. When the targets came up, the cards read middle of the road. No applause, no eye rolls. At the end of the line, Sergeant Mateo Ruiz looked once at the paper and once at the sky, and kept whatever he thought to himself. Measured silence, the kind a teacher uses when he doesn't want to bias a lesson that isn't finished. On the second string, the wind acted slippery. Flags performed at the edges like bright stage props, leaning boldly, then snapping the other way. Down by the targets, the grass moved less dramatically, but more honestly. 2 shooters rushed because a clock can feel like a dare if you let it. Their rounds sank flat into dust that would not give them back. Reed chose to wait, not as a trick, not as a gamble, just as a way to let the wind finish its sentence. He kept shoulder pressure steady, let his hands stay warm without tensing, and watched for the brief softening in the curtain of dust that tells the truth a flag sometimes exaggerates. By the last string, the range had learned the rhythm of the day. When the curtain thinned, the paper accepted a clean signature. When it thickened, he left the trigger alone. Nobody noticed exactly when the decisions were made. They noticed only that decisions had been made, and the line had not argued about them. Back at the racks, nobody joked. People who wanted to say lucky said it with fewer syllables than they had planned. Reed zipped up a pouch and stood by the fence a moment, as if replaying the last few minutes with nothing added and nothing removed. The admin note that night listed ordinary facts: variable wind, fine dust, heat above the comfort line. In the margin, someone wrote a thin sentence that meant more than it looked. Shot timing matched environmental red. That sentence did not invent a hero. It paid respect to a way of deciding. Ranges learn intention under behavior slowly. Still, the whisper traveled. If he was waiting, was he merely using the clock? A senior team leader asked for a verification run with different observers and a reshuffled line. Not to corner a man or clear him, just to clean the mirror and look again. Under similar weather, a second look took shape. Positions changed. The range OIC and the pit crew were not the same as yesterday. The shooters were asked to treat the day as itself, not as a rerun. When the line went live, some tried to play a tune they remembered, and the wind reminded them it never plays the same song twice. Reed watched the grass again. One shot when the curtain relaxed, another when it relaxed for a heartbeat in a narrower way, the last without paying rent to the ceiling of the clock. Downrange, the cardboard put down a more meaningful note than yesterday. Not tighter, so much as more honest. Doubt didn't die. It did sit down. From the company shop, the question went to battalion training. The response was practical. Run it once more under an independent observer. Clarify what waiting within the rules means in plain language, and write safety in letters big enough to be seen through pride. They laid out who calls what, when a window is real, and what to do when signals and wind disagree. This wasn't a hearing. It was a lesson with a range attached. When the independent run began, the wind brought dust in narrow sheets that appeared and erased without asking permission. Orange-vested safety hands watched through slits and spoke with panels, making themselves visible even when the air tried to eat the light. Reed kept the quiet he used when concentrating, not stubborn silence, working silence. He put the first round through a soft place in the curtain, then the second through a narrower, soft place, then the third straight through a moment that felt like a nod. The observer didn't rotate the card like a prize wheel. He lined the holes, kept his pencil still, and said only, "Record it." There was no fanfare in the voice. Neutrality can be its own kind of respect. Behind the targets, a small wobble appeared. A pit worker, moving spare backers, lifted an orange panel late. During the brief stall in the wind, the panel's corner flashed and then recovered. A heartbeat later, and it might have slipped invisible. A heartbeat earlier, and someone might have read the signal wrong. Reed had already picked that corner out with his eyes, and eased his trigger finger with a learned, almost boring restraint. When the panel finally rose clean, no shot rolled across the range. The call waited. The micro-delay did not become an argument afterward. It became a one-line reminder in the notes. Safety windows are not suggestions. The training cell wrote 3 short lines and taped them to a clipboard where young soldiers would actually see them. Read wind where it touches the target, not only where banners perform. Don't fight the clock, work inside it. Safety consumes schedule, let it. None of the lines included a name, because a method belongs to whoever uses it well. Days passed into a field problem that would test simple tasks under normal stress. Moving without drama, finding workable cover, managing shots in narrow windows without borrowing time from safety. Many people assume such days produce stories with a drum roll. They do not. They produce routines that refuse to collapse. Reed shifted from primary shooter to spot and signal, not to spotlight him, but to plug patience into the system where it would multiply. On the far side of the range road, a civilian truck paused behind the backers at the worst possible moment. A panel man hesitated. Nobody shouted. A hand signal settled the pause. The window came back when it was truly a window, not when someone wished it to be. Targets fell because decisions were honest, not because a speech convinced them to. Toward nightfall, fatigue tried to bend the rules. Crews did what good leaders do at those hours. Shorter sentences, clearer questions, no theater. In near still air, shooters love to believe the wind is gone. But a calm that flat is a kind of mirage. Reed watched the grass for a truer stillness than the flags would ever provide, and placed 3 measured rounds into paper without asking for praise. The after-action review that followed had no trophies in it. Timers on the table, cards side by side, mistakes held in daylight without ceremony. When Cruz needed an example, she described a scene instead of a name. Ruiz drew a short line in his notebook that reminded him of the small line he had rubbed on a target card earlier in the week. Good methods walk the same line in different places. By the time the unit returned to the company area, the word luck had been replaced by found the window. The verification form closed with a note that the behavior was observed and repeatable. Nobody pounded the table to claim a victory. The room grew heavier in a better way. Less hurry, more attention. On the range, someone taped a small strip where only people who worked there would ever notice it. On the strip, no slogan, just blank space. A sergeant explained to no one in particular that sometimes blank space works better than ink. Beside it, in modest handwriting, someone later added, "Read the wind first, then touch the trigger." Weeks brought a joint rehearsal with a neighboring unit. The soil smelled different there, the grass shorter and tighter. Their shooters were used to reading flags, which at that range swung in big dramatic arcs. They shot like the flags told them to, and the dust took what it wanted. Nobody was wrong, and nobody was lazy. There simply wasn't room for a better kind of waiting in their mental picture yet. In a short brief, Reed described the method without the story. Grass near the target, the thin line in the dust. Patience that doesn't argue with a clock. That afternoon, the same shooters shortened their sentences and clarified their decisions. 2 out of 3 shots found real windows. No one became a hero. Everyone became a little more exact. Back at home station, training plans absorbed small, durable edits. A standing block appeared on the calendar labeled Wind Windows. 20 minutes of hands-on work without live fire, with panels, grass, and dust only. The instruction didn't change the world. It changed days. That is better. On a quiet afternoon, an older master gunner stopped by the range, the kind who looks at scenes rather than forms. He watched the grass for a while, and then looked at 4 simple lines written on the board. He didn't ask who wrote them. He nodded to whether they worked. On a later day, a dust devil spun in a far corner of the reservation and unspooled itself before anyone could make it into a tail. The panel man read his own hand position and decided against speed. The lane came alive again when it was supposed to. The logbook kept the entire event in 1 sentence, because 1 sentence is all it earned. On another day, a private in the resupply detail felt lightheaded. The med piece did its job without drama, and nobody tried to shrink the safety bubble just because schedules exist. The line slowed by a notch, and then returned to its pace. Later, if you asked someone what happened, they would shrug. That shrug is how you know a unit is healthy. A week brought low cloud and brief pockets of haze. Signals were set flatter, not louder. Visibility is not something to negotiate. If you can't see, you wait. While waiting, you listen harder to the voice that keeps people unhurt. The haze lifted and nobody gave a speech about it. The lesson survived because it had been written small. Some afternoons, the training office linked in with a partner unit overseas. One end of the call looked out a window where the sun leaned low. The other end looked into light that had not yet softened. They did the math once at the top of the agenda to avoid confusion, and then talked about scenes rather than slides. How pine needles near a German impact area can draw a zigzag line that tells more truth than any fabric banner. How an American meadowgrass near the cardboard speaks in smaller, better sentences than a poll ever can. The 2 ends agreed without ceremony. Several small signs make one reliable answer. On a weekend open house, families toured the motor pool and the hangar, and a corner table near the range display carried the same 4 lines. A father read them to a son who asked what wind really was. "The way the air decides to walk," the father said. It was not a technical answer. It was enough. A veteran stood a few steps away and did not step closer. He did not tell his story or anyone else's. He looked once at the board and kept walking. When days lengthened again, the unit's internal review stacked numbers next to sentences the way it always did. Numbers for progress, sentences for method, abbreviations for discipline. Somewhere inside the pages, Reed's name appeared without a drum roll, almost hidden inside a procedure. Hiding there was not erasure. It was the best kind of visibility. Good methods outlive the people who first proved them. That is their job. Near the end of this run, Reed stood by the fence line one more time. The grass was nearly still. Even so, he did not make a speech in his own head. People want to hand themselves neat endings. The better ending is quieter. He looked without naming, remembered without polishing, and let the field be a field. Across the lane, someone adjusted a panel with a small wedge, so a tired hand would not need to hold it. Small improvements win arguments you never have to attend. What remains in memory is not a moment that begged for a trophy, but a pattern that refused to break. Read wind where it matters. Let time be a frame, not a fight. Give safety the first and last word. And when a window opens, use it without making the window about you. Torm. Later that day, the company gathered in a classroom with dry erase boards still smudged from older plans. Cruz wrote 4 lines in simple block letters. Read where wind touches targets. Short sentences beat loud ones. The clock is a frame. Safety owns the schedule. She turned without asking for reactions. Such lines don't need applause. They need to be used. Ruiz, who had never liked fancy language, erased a few adjectives from an older poster so the useful part of the poster could breathe. 2 privates compared notes without trying to impress each other. Somewhere in the back, Reed let the room fill with its own noise and watched which words seemed to stick. In the days that followed, the range crew mapped small friction points the way a mechanic listens for a rattle. One panel position needed a shim so hands wouldn't tire. A radio call needed a shorter phrase to reduce the urge to talk. A table inside the pit needed a strip of tape to mark "no debris here," because a clean space can stop a bad decision before anyone knows a decision is coming. Nobody called the changes innovations. They were simply good habits hardened into fixtures. And the world almost never hears about fixtures, because when they work, nothing dramatic happens. A neighboring unit arrived for a morning session and brought their own habits. Their shooters stood with clean posture and ready hands, but their eyes, like so many eyes, wanted to read the flags because flags are loud. Reed set a kneeling position near the targets and asked them to watch only the grass for a minute. The minute felt long. Then one shooter said he could see a thin run of dust bending in a way the flag had missed. The group did not nod in unison. Learning rarely looks choreographed. They ran their string later with fewer impulses to snatch at the trigger. The paper did not form perfect clusters. It formed a clear story, shots that had a reason to be taken where they were taken. Between shoots, the logistics yard demanded attention that no one writes songs about. Pallets needed labeling, straps needed checking, distances needed measuring without anxiety. Reed remembered the old habits from that life and saw how they connected to the new ones. Logistics had taught him that patience is not passive. It is active care for the order you claim to serve. On a range, that meant giving the environment the first say without letting indecision pretend to be wisdom. A young specialist in the yard watched him test the tension on a strap and asked why it mattered when the load looked fine. "Fine is temporary," Reed answered gently. "Settled is longer." An inspection team walked through with the kind of eyes that miss nothing. They asked short questions and wrote shorter notes. At the range board, the senior inspector tilted his head and asked who had authored the 4 lines. Nobody answered. Not out of coyness, out of principle. The inspector smiled anyway and circled a single word. Frame. He said the word could save a life because it shifts a soldier's argument from speed versus safety into a better argument. How to do work inside boundaries without resenting them. Training bled into a low-stress field exercise. Command emphasized no heroics, just execution. The lanes were simple and unforgiving. Move what needs moving, observe what can be observed, and realize that simple plans break in complex ways if attention drops. On a spur road, a driver misread a hand signal and braked inside a blind curve. Nothing bad happened because nothing else was allowed to move until the picture made sense again. Later, the driver apologized with honest embarrassment. Crews told him that apology mattered less than the pause he had taken after braking. The pause had kept the picture from getting worse. In that quiet correction, the unit heard a style of leadership that dislikes humiliation and loves improvement. Shifts grew longer near the end of that cycle, the way shifts always do. Fatigue settled on faces without asking permission. In those hours, small ugliness creeps in, snapping at a panel man for missing a cue, shaving corners around almost safe, suggesting that the clock can be bent when nobody's watching. Crews reminded everyone in a voice that neither begged nor threatened that safety is not the enemy of momentum. It is the only momentum that survives contact with real life. Someone taped the word patient inside the pit where only the crew would see it, not like a banner, more like a note a friend leaves you because he knows you will hit a wall and forget who you are for a minute. In the after-action tent, which smelled faintly of canvas and coffee, numbers sat beside sentences again. They showed a steadier pattern than the month before. Fewer late calls, fewer whispers of almost, better shot selection inside short windows. Ruiz confessed, in his economical way, that he had been ready to dislike the whole read the grass idea on first hearing. He didn't dislike it anymore. He didn't love it either. He trusted it, which is stronger. Trust, in his view, lives somewhere between blind faith and permanent suspicion, the small neighborhood where better results actually live. Word drifted to a headquarters section that sometimes confused Polish with progress. They wanted a bulletized list of takeaways. Crews sent 7 lines written as plainly as a grocery run. See where the wind really touches, call what you see, wait inside rules. Don't talk for the sake of sound, make safety visible, choose honest windows, write lessons small. The response from above was just as simple. Keep doing that and write an update at the end of the quarter. Nobody asked for a video, a poster, or a coin. The absence of spectacle felt like permission to keep being normal and good. A rumor tried to grow that Reed was now the wind guy. He didn't want the title and didn't need the headache that comes with little titles. He asked to rotate through stations like everyone else and quietly coached without making coaching into a personality. When a private asked for a secret trick, he said there wasn't one, and the private looked disappointed until the next shoot, when he placed a shot in an honest window and realized that sometimes the secret is accepting there isn't one. During a lull, a dust column rose near the tree line and dissolved without touching the lanes. It did not make the log except as a margin scribble. A truck stalled at a bad angle during a resupply and was pulled straight by a winch without commentary. A water can cracked and was swapped out before anyone got thirsty. 100 small rescues took place that week that no one would remember by name because they were not the kind of rescues that involve sirens. They were the kind that keep sirens unnecessary. On a gray morning, a visiting officer asked crews if the unit would demonstrate its method for an audience. She declined politely. A method held up for show becomes theater fast. She offered an alternative. Watch any normal training period unannounced with a notebook. The officer agreed, and later wrote down that he had witnessed very few speeches and very few mistakes, and felt that the two facts were related. Back in the classroom, the 4 lines on the board collected a 5th, written smaller, more than one sign. The addition wasn't flashy. It told people not to trust a single flag or a single glint, but to make 3 small pieces agree before acting. Underneath, a private added in pencil, and the 4th sign is us, meaning the human body. Tired hands, wandering attention, the way caffeine makes patience feel like weakness if you let it. No one erased the pencil line. It stayed as a reminder that people, not diagrams, are what need the most careful reading. A weekend brought families onto the post. People admired vehicles, asked questions that grown soldiers forget to ask, and ate food that never tastes quite right under fluorescent lights. The range corner sat quiet, just a table and the lines. A veteran paused, smiled without explaining why, and kept moving. A child stared at the grass beyond the fence like it might speak if he looked long enough. Maybe it did. When the quarter closed, the unit turned in a short update. Fewer near-miss calls, steadier schedules that still respected safety, better qualification outcomes without gaming the clock. There was a paragraph at the end about culture, which they rarely wrote, because culture is what you feel when you stop listing facts. It said, in the flattest possible language, that people had started to wait for real windows rather than the ones they wished to see. In the lull after that report, Reed found a quiet edge of the range where you could hear fence wire sing a little when the breeze got it right. He ran his fingers along a post and let the silence do most of the talking. He wasn't trying to hold on to a moment. He was trying to practice letting good moments pass without demanding they mean more than they already did. That is a kind of discipline no checklist measures. On a later visit, the master gunner came back and watched again, this time during a routine block. He noticed a panel operator adjust the wedge under the panel so he wouldn't have to white-knuckle it through a whole string. He noticed that nobody felt the need to narrate every thought over the net. He noticed that when a shooter saw no honest window, he simply didn't shoot. The master gunner signed nothing and said almost nothing. On his way out, he tapped the corner of the board where the lines lived and said just loud enough to be heard, "Keep them small." A season turned. The air felt heavier some days, and so did people. On those days, the best thing the unit did was shrink the plan by 10% and execute the smaller plan cleanly. Reed believed that shrinking a plan on purpose might be the least celebrated leadership act in the Army, right beside admitting you need water and shortening your sentence when you're tempted to make it a paragraph. He tried to practice all 3 and hoped patience would leave a longer shadow than any compliment a person could pin to him. A young leader asked crews during a mentorship hour how to know when waiting had turned from discipline into avoidance. She said to check 3 things. Are you still reading the world, or just your nerves? Are you protecting safety or your reputation? Are you talking less because the picture is clear, or because you don't want to choose? If the answers drifted the wrong way, it was time to move. If they pointed toward care, it was time to keep waiting. The young leader wrote that down and surprised himself by using it the very next day. There were rough days, too. A target frame splintered at the worst time. A comset died and forced hand signals to do more work. A truck refused to start and had to be pushed without letting momentum become risk. Bad days are part of the same story. The key is that they didn't become an excuse to lope past safety or blame wind for human choices. The lines on the board didn't guarantee perfection. They guaranteed a direction to walk when things went noisy. Reed rotated off the range for a while and back into the parts of the job that most stories skip. He found himself sorting forms, taping corners, and reminding people how to stack boxes so they do not shift when roads surprise them. Someone asked if it felt like a step backward. He said no, and meant it. Good shooting and good stacking share a spine. You watch for small dishonesty in your environment, and you do not invite it. That kind of answer doesn't make a highlight reel. It does make a week run smoother. The unit invited neighboring leaders for a no-nonsense talk about standard blocks. No projector, no swagger, just coffee and notebooks. They compared where people naturally cheat the clock and where the clock deserves to be allowed to rule. Someone said out loud that cutting a safety corner is not the same thing as performing under pressure. The room agreed faster than anyone expected, which suggested the idea had been waiting in all their heads for someone to give it permission. On a quiet afternoon, when nothing seemed to be happening, a private noticed a piece of tape curling off the edge of the pit table. He pressed it back, and then replaced it clean. It was the kind of moment that doesn't crave narration, but a small wave of satisfaction passed through the crew, as if the table itself had been grateful. This is what a culture looks like when it turns the corner. Not louder, not prettier, just calmer, more exact, less interested in performance than in care. And so the story refuses a drumroll ending on purpose. There are no fireworks to point at, and no perfect groups to frame. There is a method that survived contact with wind, dust, schedules, fatigue, and pride, and it did so without asking for a stage. If you must look for a symbol, look at the small strip of blank space someone taped near the board. Beside it, in a modest hand, a line that outlived the need to have an author. Read the wind first, then touch the trigger. Training rolled on with the kind of cadence that leaves no fingerprints. The shooters who once talked too much on the net learned to let a small quiet do the bulk of the work. The panel crew discovered they could trade positions without losing tempo if each person narrated only what actually mattered. The OIC rotated observers so no one's ego could settle into a throne. Nothing about it would sell a movie ticket, which is exactly why it worked. A young specialist from another company arrived with a chip on his shoulder and the sort of confidence that breaks easily under real wind. He went hard on his first string and watched the dust eat his certainty. He didn't get mocked. He got a stool, a bottle of water, and a quick talk that did not make a sermon out of his mistake. He listened, nodded once, and stood up without drama. His second try looked like it belonged to someone else. Fewer impulses, more reading, fewer excuses. The card downrange didn't crown him king. It shook his hand. The S3 shop asked crews to write a short note about lessons that travel well. She wrote that travel is the wrong metaphor. Lessons do not ride in trucks, they grow in rooms. If you want them to grow in new rooms, plant them small, in everyday practices, not in speeches. Put a wedge under a panel, tape the corner of a table. Let a shooter skip a bad window without punishing his restraint. She ended the note by saying that a lesson's best day is the day nobody remembers who introduced it. A rumor lasted exactly one afternoon that the range would start timing shooters more aggressively to drive urgency. It died quietly when someone held the rumor up next to the 4 lines on the board and asked what problem that urgency would solve that patience couldn't. No one had a good answer. Urgency had its place, inside a true window, for instance. But urgency used as decoration wastes people. The rumor limped away and found no friends. Another visiting team wanted to talk about reading the human signs. That part never comes easy. People prefer a wind flag to an honest face. Flags are simple. Faces are complicated. The crew tried anyway. They made a list of small signals. Hands that will not relax on the stock. Breathing that refuses to settle. A voice that gets bright for no reason. A laugh that arrives too fast. Eyes that dart to check the clock, even when the clock isn't running them. None of the signals was a sin. They were reminders that bodies are part of the picture and sometimes the loudest part. The team left with a page that looked boring. That boredom hides power. On a long, flat afternoon, the sky pulled a lid over the range and the flags went lazy. The grass still spoke in thin movements that could feel invisible if you wanted an excuse. But excuses had gotten scarce. Shooters waited not for perfection, but for enough. Enough softening to make a shot honest. One by one, holes appeared exactly where effort met care. No one clapped. Quiet competence has no theme music. It has results, and people who go home without a knot in their stomach. A chaplain stopped by the line, as chaplains sometimes do, and asked nobody in particular how patience differed from fear. Reed said, without turning it into a speech, that patience makes a place for a good decision to land, while fear runs away from any decision at all. The chaplain said that sounded like the kind of difference a person learns by doing, not by reading. He wasn't wrong. The unit later compiled a page of micro-fixes they were proud of. A shorter checklist that actually gets used. A single strip of paint that keeps a truck from parking where a truck never should. A small shield on a cable that used to fray. A simple phrase for the net that stops paragraph-length updates from drowning actions. None of it would raise a cheer. All of it would reduce the kinds of days that end badly. When an evaluation team finally appeared with clipboards and polite smiles, they found very little to correct. They did, however, ask why the board in the range shack had no names beneath the lines. Crews said they had chosen that on purpose because names get traded, moved, promoted, and forgotten. And a good line should not depend on a business card. The team wrote collective authorship in the remarks and checked the box that meant effective, sustainable, repeatable. It was the most boring praise available. It was perfect. By then, even the people who wanted to tease Reed about being the grass reader had lost interest in the joke because the joke required a punchline that reality no longer provided. He was simply one more person doing a job the way it needed to be done. When asked what he wanted out of the whole thing, he said a range day where nobody's voice climbed and nobody's hands shook. He got several. If this story asks for any conclusion, it is this. Habits eat talent for breakfast, and respect, real, ordinary respect, makes the habits stick. The wind doesn't care what you think of yourself. The paper doesn't care either. People do. They notice when you wait inside rules instead of rewriting them. They notice when your respect for safety is not a performance, but a preference. They notice when you make blank space on a wall mean more than the loudest poster. So the 4 lines stayed up, with their 5th line scribbled underneath, and the pencil note about the 4th sign being human. And day by day, with almost no theater to speak of, the method kept proving that small, honest decisions add up to a range where drama stays rare, where targets fall because windows are real, and where going home safe is the quiet prize everyone keeps winning. In the quiet after the line went cold, the independent observer gathered the small group that had been watching with him and walked through what they had seen without decorating it. He drew a square in the dust with his boot and called it the picture. Then he tapped 3 corners, wind where it touched the target, the safety signal that made the picture safe to act on, and the human factor that could tilt the picture without warning. Only when the three corners agreed, he said, did the picture earn the right to be called clear. Someone asked what exactly counted as a window. He answered that a window is not a number on a clock. It is a brief easing in the wind that makes a shot honest, the kind of softening you can see where dust thins and grass moves in a smaller language than flags. Someone else asked about the orange board the pit crew kept lifting. He said that panel in the pits is a simple promise made visible, the crew's way of saying the lane is safe, a hand you can see even when the air tries to swallow light. The after-action notes from that day read like a recipe with no flourishes. Observe where the wind truly touches. Confirm that the signal is clean and human hands are steady. And only then let the clock matter. What they wrote down was not a trick. It was a posture, shoulders that settle before decisions, breaths that count without counting out loud, and a willingness to pass on a shot when the picture refuses to make sense. Reed did not argue with any of it. He simply nodded in the way a person nods when he recognizes something he has already been doing and now has better words for. The group left the berms without ceremony, and the range kept the lesson the way ranges do, by letting the next ordinary day test whether the lesson can stand without being announced. If a moment like this has ever changed how you decided, share it below. And if you want more grounded stories told with respect, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.